So, time then for the press preview. Lots to talk about as we take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. Tonight, we'll see what's making the headlines with Rachel Watson and Peter Geoghegan. Speak to them in a moment after we've had a look at those front pages for you, starting with the Telegraph. And on the eve of the new Prime Minister being announced, the Telegraph reports frontrunner Liz Truss is considering freezing energy bills for millions of households this winter if she wins. The Daily Express also leads on comments made by Ms Truss, promising immediate action to help with soaring energy bills. According to the Mirror, Liz Truss is still a week away from having a cost of living plan. But the Times reports that she is to announce a vast support package to deal with surging energy costs, including a gas and electricity price freeze. The frontrunner to be the next Prime Minister also features on the front of The Guardian. As you can see there, it says she will press on with tax cuts. While the FT quotes Kwasi Kwarteng as he sets out to reassure markets that Ms Truss will not blow a hole in the public finances if she gets the top job. He, of course, may end up as Chancellor. The iFront reports PM in waiting with a picture of the frontrunner, once again Liz Truss. BBC Comic mocks Liz Truss is the headline on the Daily Mail, referring, of course, to comedian Joe Lycett's appearance on Laura Kuenssberg's new show. The Metro reports on the arrest of 3 new suspects by police hunting the masked gunman who shot dead 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell in Liverpool a fortnight ago. And the Daily Star reports that pubs need help with energy costs or customers will face an increase in the price of pints. And don't forget, just scan the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme and you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And I'm joined tonight by political editor of the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson, also editor-in-chief at openDemocracy, Peter Geoghegan. Great to see you both this Sunday evening. And we have a lot to talk about on the eve of what is going to be a momentous week in Westminster. Rachel, perhaps we can start with you. And in fact, the Telegraph and the Times, both with very similar headlines. The Telegraph saying Truss could freeze bills to avoid energy Armageddon. The Times saying Truss team hold talks on freezing energy bills. She wasn't particularly forthcoming today, was she, when she was interviewed about what her plans are? But it does seem, well, she certainly didn't rule out or rule in freezing bills. Something Labour's been calling for, Rachel.
Yeah, so there's one theme that dominates the front pages tomorrow, and obviously that is the new Prime Minister, who is expected to be Liz Truss, in a little over 12 hours announced, and the energy crisis that we are all in the grip of at the moment. And the Telegraph and the Times seem to have got a little bit more information than others. As you said, Liz Truss this morning, she didn't give much away. She said that if she is the new Prime Minister, she will act within the week to bring forward more support and help families and businesses across the country. And what we learned from the Telegraph and the Times tomorrow is that Liz Truss is planning to freeze energy bills to avoid, as they say, this Armageddon that families are facing. Now, what we don't know are the specifics of that. So there's chat within these stories. People have spoken to campaign insiders, they've spoken to energy company insiders who say they expect a freeze to be announced in the next few days, but we don't know, who will that impact? What will that freeze be? What, where on the scale can we expect a freeze to be? How much will people still have to pay? Where will that money come from? So all these details we still don't have. We just know a little bit more, and that Liz Truss might be minded now to look at an energy freeze. There's also talk within these two pieces of the help that she will announce being greater than the money that was spent on furlough. So, we are expecting now, if Liz Truss, as we all expect, is named Prime Minister tomorrow, for there to be some huge package. Now, whether she has that or that this is just, a bit of bump in the papers ahead of her being announced Prime Minister tomorrow, we don't know. But there is huge pressure for whoever the next Prime Minister is to deal with this energy crisis. Yep. And, they will have to come forward within the first few days because of the paralysis the government has been under for the last 2 months.
That's right. And Peter, it was interesting hearing from our political editor, Beth Rigby, tonight, saying she's been speaking to sources close to Liz Truss who say it's going to be a big bang approach, a shock and awe moment, bigger than many people expect. Something is needed, and it is needed soon.
Well, this is a huge thing for Liz Truss, and in some ways, it's either it probably is go big or go home. Because if this is not a big enough package, if this is not a big enough approach, she's had plenty of time to think about it. We spent now 6 weeks when we know who the effective new prime minister is going to be, nothing has really happened to try and address this issue. And if it isn't big enough, and if she gets if it's criticised for not being big enough, that will, I think, probably come to define her entire premiership. So it really is a huge moment. There's a lot of briefing that's going to be as big as the furlough scheme. Kind of ironically, given that some of Liz Truss's supporters viciously attacked Rishi Sunak during the Tory leadership campaign for the furlough scheme, for the amount of money that was spent on that. But I think that's the reality of the situation. This is going to require massive state intervention. Otherwise, people are going to literally die in their homes this winter. So it's now finally been briefed. It's still quite bare in terms of what we know about it, and some of the papers, as said at the start, really, are criticising Liz Truss for it. There's been a lot of time, and there's a huge amount of time she's had to come up with a plan. So finally, some details are emerging, but for a lot of people, it's still something that they're not clear. We're still not clear what exactly it's going to look like.
Yeah, interesting seeing the front of the Mirror saying Truss, wait a week for crisis plan, saying, yet more delay. Let's talk about the front of the Guardian, shall we, Rachel? Because, of course, it's not just Britain suffering with the cost of living crisis. Germany hit particularly hard because of their reliance on Russian energy. And Olaf Scholz has been promising the people of Germany some help.
Yeah, so I think this is another area where there will be pressure for Liz Truss to act immediately when she comes in, because, as you say, it's not only the UK that's in the middle of this energy crisis. There are other countries across the world, across Europe, who are suffering, and we see now additional support in these countries coming forward that will, heap that pressure on, as I said. So we know in Germany, Olaf Scholz announced today relief worth around 65 billion euros, around roughly 56 million pounds worth of relief to cut consumer prices of gas, oil and coal, a windfall tax on electricity providers as well. So we've seen this action in other countries where, as Peter says, as we discussed, there's been almost a paralysis in the UK for the last 2 months while this Tory leadership competition has gone on. Now, there has been help in some ways, but there's a lot of additional support that's needed. And we're seeing this in other countries at the moment as new packages are announced. And I think this will feed in this week to that pressure of that the new Prime Minister is under. I think, as Peter says, this has got to be go big or go home, because we're seeing other people act. So, if Liz Truss doesn't have a plan that's already well thought out, that is well progressed, she's had a lot of time to deal with this. This is the top of her in tray, and it has been for the whole of this Tory leadership competition. It has to be dealt with immediately. And if there's not a plan there, she will be criticised. And I think it could define her going forward. We're not that far off from a general election, even if there's not a snap election, as some people think there might be. So I think this is something that we need to see, not only that pressure at home, but there will be pressure looking around overseas at how it's dealt with. Countries like Germany, as you mentioned, they do have that additional pressure of where they get their oil and gas from and the supply. But here, there does need to be action immediately, and they will be looking at other countries and what they're doing.
Yeah, who would want this job, Peter? The front of the FT is talking about the markets. They're obviously extremely jittery and concerned about all of this and what's going to happen. Their headline: Truss will be safe hand on public finances, pledges ally Kwarteng. Anyone would think he's after a job.
Yes, who could possibly imagine he might be? And obviously, Kwasi Kwarteng's a long-term ally of Liz Truss. They kind of come from that kind of right of the Tory party, co-authors of books together, etc. So it's an interesting place for Kwarteng to make this intervention as well. The FT ran a very critical front page of Truss's economics at their weekend paper yesterday, in which they basically crunched their own numbers and were arguing that the supposed fiscal headroom that Truss says there is for tax cuts just doesn't exist now because of inflation, even since she made those promises. So, maybe this is an attempt both by Kwarteng, but you'd imagine by Truss as well, to try and get some credibility and legitimacy, because she has been heavily criticised for her economic policies. And even this morning, when she was speaking to Laura Kuenssberg, talking about how the real problem has been this kind of focus on redistribution over the last 20 years, which would be a surprise to a lot of people, given that real term wages haven't risen, are still at 2007 levels, and inequality has risen massively over the last 15 or 20 years too. So, Truss is seen as coming from the slightly cranky Tory right in many respects, and this feels like an attempt to try and put them a bit more in the centre.
Yeah, Rachel, what do you make of, I mean, if it is Liz Truss, of course, we're assuming it's going to be, but if she is the new Prime Minister, what about how split the party is? Because more than two-thirds of Tory MPs in the first round didn't vote for her. Can she bring the party together? I mean, Boris Johnson pleading in yesterday's papers that the party needs to be united behind her.
I think, again, this is a huge task for the next Prime Minister, because we did see huge splits with the Conservative Party at the end, towards the end, before Boris Johnson resigned. We're still seeing those splits. The start of this leadership competition was quite nasty when you look at how some of the candidates were treated, the briefings to the press. So there's a huge task there, because people are still unhappy about how Boris Johnson handled Partygate, for example, how he was in government. And Liz Truss is not seen as that full breakaway. You just see who some of the potential cabinet ministers are, for example, not huge breakaways from Boris Johnson's government. In Scotland, we had people briefing before we got down to the final two of what a disaster Liz Truss would be for the Union and for the Scottish Conservatives. Now, she is getting support up here. That came fairly late on, but she does have some MSPs backing her and Scottish MPs. But I think, there's a lot of work to try and gain the trust of the party. And as I said before, we're not that far away from an election, so that has to be done fairly quickly as well. So there's a lot of tasks here for the Prime Minister. Now, obviously, the first task is dealing with the cost of living crisis, pulling together for the country. But in her mind as well, she will be thinking about the future of the party. There's huge concern about the damage that's already been done to the Conservatives. Will that be lasting damage, for example? If they do lose an election, how long could they be out of power? All these things will be going through people's minds in the Conservative Party as we come to the end of this leadership contest.
Yeah, just before we go to the break, Peter, your thoughts on this? There's been so much blue-on-blue fighting, hasn't there? Lots of squabbling over the last few weeks. Can Liz Truss, as well as everything else, bring the party together?
Yeah, casting forward from where we are today, obviously we'll get the results tomorrow, etc., and Liz Truss almost certainly become Prime Minister on Tuesday. But probably the most interesting thing is what will happen next with Cabinet. And there's not that much briefings in the paper. There's been some briefings in the Sundays today about where that might go. Who will be in her cabinet? Who will she keep from the Boris Johnson administration? Who will she bring in that supported Rishi Sunak, etc., etc., etc.? And I think that will be quite a big internal Conservative Party issue. And the other thing is that for a lot of people in the country, they don't really know who Liz Truss is. And it remains to be seen quite how convinced they will be by Liz Truss once they see her, because she is, for a lot of people outside of the likes of us who sit on late night television programs, she's not someone that has had a huge stature. She's been the foreign secretary, yes, but she's not someone that's a kind of a defining political figure of the last 10 or 15 years. So there's a lot of other kind of machinations of the Conservative Party and how they might react given how the public views her in the coming weeks and months will keep us all entertained.
I mean, it really will. So much work to do. All right, both, thank you for the moment. We're going to take a quick break. Coming up, the Daily Mail focuses on comedian Joe Lycett's appearance on Laura Kuenssberg's new show. BBC Comic mocks Liz Truss is their headline, discussing that and more next. Welcome back. Part 2 of the press preview. Rachel and Peter still with us. Rachel, front page of the Daily Mail. The Mail having a pop at the BBC after a comic appears on a political show this morning.
Yeah, so again, in keeping with the theme of Tory leadership, but slightly different and not really addressing the cost of living crisis, rather, as you say, Joe Lycett on Laura Kuenssberg's show on the BBC today. And, having a bit of a pop at him over his sarcasm when he was on there. And I think, he's a comedian. I'm sure the BBC were well aware of his views and how he is when he was booked. So I think, I've looked on Twitter today and saw both, there's two sides to this, people having a go. I thought it was interesting that they decided this was the way to go rather than talk about the cost of living crisis that other papers have. But I think, there are, Liz Truss spoke on the television this morning, and as we've spoken about and as we can see across a lot of the papers, she didn't tell us very much about what she was going to say. She said that a plan for the energy crisis would be unveiled within a week. Even when we've got briefings in some of the papers, we find out just little bits, not all the details. And I think, as I said earlier, she's going to be unveiled as the next Prime Minister, we think. within the next just over 12 hours. So, I think there's a little bit to be said. He is a comedian on a Sunday morning television show. How seriously should we be taking his reaction to Liz Truss? It was meant in humour. He is a comedian. He wants.
You can't book a comedian and then say that that you don't like his jokes, can you? I mean, I suppose there are two things here, Peter, aren't there? Firstly, is it right for a political show in a very serious time to have a comedian on giving his thoughts? And secondly, what do you make of this slightly odd front page for the Mail, given that we're on the eve of this huge week in Westminster?
I'm just amazed that it took 2 bylines to write this story. There's as far as I can gather from the front page, there's basically nothing in it. And I think it was the fact that there was so much fulmination today about what Joe Lycett did, which is effectively send up the entire genre of political shows. And the fact that, as Rachel says, Liz Truss said very little on the television. And what Joe Lycett was doing was what lots of other people who, frankly, have even less qualification to do so than Joe Lycett, from anonymously funded think tanks to fairly random people from the internet who have political persuasions in one direction or another, who get put on to daytime television shows and asked to wax lyrical on the politics of the day. I think what Joe Lycett did was send all of that up, and in some ways, it really, I think, hammered home just how little Liz Truss had actually said. And I think we've kind of, in some ways as well, tended to treat politics as entertainment. I think probably we all have. I think I said at the end of the last clip about how it'll be an entertaining few months, whatever happens. We tend to kind of look at politics as entertainment in some ways. And it's really, really not. It's a really serious thing. And what she's talking about, the cost of living crisis, is going to affect literally tens of millions of people in this country. And she's not telling them what she's going to do. And that must be really, it's very stressful, especially for people who've got kids and families and already struggling to survive. What's going to happen?
OK, we've just got 30 seconds left.
She doesn't turn up on television and talk about it.
Yeah, sorry, just breaking up there slightly. We've just got 20 seconds to talk about the enemy of the state, Trump blasting Biden. Just give me one sentence on this, Rachel.
I mean, given how divisive politics is, and not only here but in the US, it's a pretty, irresponsible thing to say, but again, it is the former President Trump saying it, so should we expect this? But I think given the heat in politics, we saw what happened at the Capitol previously. To still be talking like this is really kind of, it's difficult to explain.
We'll discuss it further after in about half an hour. Thanks both very much.